Hi Elkie, this is your Saturday art lesson, and it's about viscosity. Now, you may never have heard the word viscosity, but it's very important in painting. What it means is wetness, how wet something is. So for example, this water is very wet. It's completely wet. As a matter of fact, that's how we think of water is by its wetness. But this purple paint is not as wet. So for example, if I put my brush in it, see, it's a little bit wet. But if I add water to this purple paint, I make it more viscous. I give it more viscosity. I make it more watery. Now the thing about colors is that the thicker the paint is, the darker the color will be. And the thinner the paint is, the lighter the color will be. So the more viscous the paint is, the lighter it'll be, because the color of the paper shows through the paint. So, viscosity is a very, very important thing in painting. And you can remember one of the things that we did to take advantage of the wetness of the paint is to touch it. Because when you touch it, it takes paint off, makes it a little bit lighter. And if you touch it with a rag, even more so. Now, what if we wanted to have not the paint be more viscous, but if we wanted the paper to be more viscous? Well, what I could do is I could wet the paper like this. I could wet the paper, but if I wet the paper with this brush, by the time I get to the bottom, the top will be dry. If I want the whole sheet of paper to be wet at once, I would have to use a bigger brush and paint the whole thing with a bigger brush, but you might not have a bigger brush. So the best thing to do is to wet the whole paper with this, a sprayer that you use on plants. Now watch. Now my whole board is wet. Also, I have this lighter piece of paper and I'm going to wet that too, because I want to show you something else later. Now what I want to show you right away is what happens when you wet a thick piece of paper and a thin piece of paper. The thin piece of paper becomes translucent. That means you can see through it. The thin piece of paper gets wrinkly and the thick piece of paper doesn't. So what we're going to do next, the thicker the paper, the better it'll work. Now, when I took my thick paint and put it on a dry board, you could see the edges of my color very clearly, top and bottom. But if I put the same color on a damp board, it'll do something entirely different. See what happened when I sprayed it? It runs out from the color and makes like a halo. And I've been kind of silent while I was doing that. What I want you to notice is that if I just did this, it doesn't have anywhere near the same kind of effect that working on a wet board has. See the difference? And even after I do this, I'm still not going to get the same effect, even if I were to do this. Although I would start to have a similar effect, but never like that. So your assignment is, just checking how this paper does. This paper is much better. Your assignment is to do a wet ground acrylic painting to show viscosity. Not quite done with my picture. There. Now I'm going to sign it. Now, what if you don't still have that tube of purple acrylic paint that I remember on the dining room table when you lived at Maplewood Avenue? Well, you can do this with watercolor, but it won't be as good. So that's your Saturday lesson.